Thank you very much, Reverend Kawonga, for the introduction. And welcome to all of us who are participating in this seminar today. The title of my topic is Resistance Against Oppressive Economic Systems, a reflection on 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 1 to 20, and the 1915 Chilembwe Uprising in Malawi. Norman Gottwald affirms that the state and the agrarian populace in the ancient Near East coexisted in an easy tension that sometimes broke into open conflict. Mostly the tensions occurred when the state wanted to extract surpluses from the peasants, the main producers of essential commodities. For this reason, these tensions should be understood as strongly linked to economies of extraction and allocation, which are part of every society. Economies of extraction denote a process of extracting something from a producer by someone or some group that has not produced it. The process is exploitive as it involves those who do not labor gaining from those who labor. In ancient biblical times, economies of extraction involved a local city-state extracting from peasants and an imperial power extracting from subject states through tribute, which was the main form of exploitation. Because of these measures, many peasants already living in the margins were further impoverished and driven into debt. The system was pre-capitalist because a strong state and the upper classes dominated the majority of the people through taxes, rents, and debts. Such systems always force states to move from a political economy in which wealth was the product of diligent work and therefore a blessing from God, to a political economy in which wealth was the product of oppression of the poor. The revolt of the northern tribes of Israel in 1 Kings chapter 12 and the 1915 Chilembwe Uprising in Malawi are perfect examples of what is being argued here. We notice that in both instances, forced labor and heavy taxes are married together to form part of the grievances contributing to the rise of resistance voices against those in power. The two cases are an embodiment of peasants' resistance against the powers behind oppressive economic systems, and they assist us to understand the meaning of resistance theology. It needs to be stated here that forms of extraction were also found in African traditional society, where villagers would offer tribute to their king. Of course, there is a strong emphasis on economies of allocation in the rural economy, where it is believed that crops, children, and all good things are provided by God and ancestors. In such an economy, the land belongs to the people, comes from God and the ancestors. The deity is not only responsible for fertility of the soil, but also of the animals and human beings. The only difference is that in the village commune, allocation and extraction are kind of balanced. The king knows that if he extracts too much, the people will starve and they will not work and then the whole system comes out of balance. What happens, though, in a state run by powerful elites is that the balances of allocation and extraction become distorted. The emergence of city-state, or what Gerard West calls temple economy, and Roland Bohr calls it sacred economy, always takes away what is bearable form of extraction and replaces it with exploitive one. Bohr observes that once you merge into city-state, you have a class of people who do not care. Extraction becomes the emphasis because the city lifestyle relies on that extraction. This paper analyzes political and economic dimensions of 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 1 to 20, using the Malawian 1915 Chilembwe Uprising as an additional interpretive resource. The paper will present, firstly, a careful social historical analysis of 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 1 to 20, and then we'll go on to reflect on the 1915 Chilembwe Uprising with an aim of bringing the two contexts into dialogue. When brought into interpretive dialogue, these socio-historical resonances provide additional interpretive resources for understanding the biblical text and also the Malawian context. The paper serves to demonstrate that allocative economies are powerful to the effect that any system that works against its beliefs creates tensions. In essence, the tensions are a clash between centralized economy and the rural village-based economy. Let's look at the social historical analysis of 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 1 to 20, while also reflecting on the resistance theology in the Old Testament. Wittenberg terms tensions between centralized economy and the rural village-based economy as a resistance or prophetic theology, because it is a theology not from above, but from below. It is from below because it is initiated and carried by the people themselves upon realizing that they are being oppressed. In the third world countries, this kind of theology is called people's theology. This theology is always in opposition to all oppressive systems. We find people's theology in the rebellion of the northern tribes. The context suggests that Rehoboam went to Shechem not on his own initiative, but at the insistence of the northern tribes. The rebellion was directly linked to economics. The structure of 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 1 to 20 itself demonstrates the dynamics of imposition of and the resistance against economic exploitation. The text belongs to the Old Testament tradition that rejected the centralized power and its oppressive economic mechanisms. It needs to be mentioned here that 1 Kings 12 confirms and exposes economic exploitation that Samuel defined in 1 Samuel chapter 8. Revolt of northern tribes after the death of Solomon is a perfect example of Old Testament stories that help us to understand the people's resistance against powers behind exploitive economic mechanisms. The grievances raised by Jeroboam and the northern tribes of Israel should be understood as emanating from oppressive economic systems that supported monarchic Israel. West identifies household or communitarian and tributary modes of production as economic systems that undergirded biblical societies. The two, alongside slave-based mode of production, provide a most effective large-scale historical framework for the Bible. The communitarian mode of production was dominant in the initial Israelite settlements in Canaan. The tributary mode of production was introduced when Israel turned to monarchy. The communitarian mode of production did not prevail once Israel itself became a monarchy with its own kings. The rise of the Israelite monarchy meant that tribes of Israel were now moving towards a system, the tributary mode of production they had opposed when they first arrived in Canaan. The tributary mode of production was the most oppressive machinery because it burdened the people through taxes, temple tithes, and imperial rulers' tribute, which the king extracted from the poor to maintain the city or state fundamental economic structure. Of worth noting is the fact that prophetic voices also arise in opposition to economic systems. We observe that it was the turn to monarchy that set the stage for Israel's prophets to appear. To be precise, as Thomas puts it, prophets in ancient Israel arose mainly in opposition to economic systems that were forced on the people and were exploitive. He says the role of the prophets was to apply the communitarian ethic of the underclass to a prosperous kingship which had turned to conscription and exploitation. In other words, we can say prophets in Israel arose in opposition to the tributary mode of production, which should also be understood as the main economic system behind the grievances raised by the northern tribes of Israel in 1 Kings chapter 12. What is conspicuous is the fact that forced labor and heavy taxes are married together and presented as the yoke that Solomon imposed on his people, to the effect that the two became the main reasons behind the breakup of the Davidic Empire. Now we turn to the early resistance theology in Malawi, reflecting on the 1915 Chilembwe Uprising. Equally important to note is the marriage of forced labor and heavy taxes that form part of the grievances contributing to the rise of resistance or prophetic voices against colonial rule in Malawi. What is remarkable is that such voices began to be heard immediately after the British established colonial rule in Malawi in 1891. The year was a defining moment because political and economic devices that were laid down at that time had enduring effects on the social life of Malawi. With the coming of Harry Johnston's administration, many African communities became vulnerable to injustices perpetrated by colonial government. These changes led the church to take up a new role of being the voice of the voiceless, which had strong political and prophetic influences. The church, particularly Scottish missionaries, felt that it was their responsibility to speak for the ordinary people in the villages against unjust policies carried by British government. Because of this, Scottish missionaries and their local parishioners were always at loggerheads with British administration for the entire 73 years of British rule. In the first decade of British rule, prophetic voices were largely coming from Scottish missionaries of Blantyre and the Livingstonia missions. Among them, David Clement Scott, leader of the Blantyre mission, was singled out as the most vocal Scottish critic of colonial government. During his years at Blantyre, Scott demonstrated a concern for human justice in the face of state oppression, which brought him into conflict both with the colonial authorities and the church authorities in Scotland. In 1912, the first Native Association was formed with the aim of making sure that the voices of the indigenous people are heard. The people's discontent reached its climatic stage in 1915 when John Chilembwe led an insurrection. This uprising is a perfect example that best illustrates tensions between the village-based economy and the state economy. The grievances contributing to the uprising were closely linked to exploitative economic mechanisms that were laid down by the British government. The flowing together of forced labor, taxes, and other injustices were the main factors that contributed to the 1915 uprising. The grievances that Chilembwe raised and the subsequent uprising assists us to understand why the northern tribes of Israel rebelled against Rehoboam in 1 Kings chapter 12. Chilembwe was greatly grieved by Tangata system, which was considered to be another form of slave trade. Tangata means help, but the one introduced by British government and European farmers was not Tangata at all. It was compulsory labor that natives allowed out of fear. Chilembwe was also grieved by taxes that vexed people countrywide. The British colonial government introduced a hard tax, particularly to raise revenue and partly to compel Africans to work for European estate owners. Chilembwe was particularly annoyed with the conduct of tax collectors who went out terrorizing villagers by raping and harassing wives of tax defaulters and demanding free chickens and maize flour from them. He was saddened to see most of the fertile land that traditionally belonged to the people being taken away. Chilembwe was critical of the use of Nyasaland African troops in campaigns against fellow Africans. In 1914, he was not happy to see Africans who benefited nothing being forced to go and fight in the war he believed only saved European interests. Chilembwe was also displeased with the way Africans living on land occupied by European settlers were treated. So he staged a rising in 1915 to try remove foreign domination in his country and give his people freedom. Colonial and imperial powers reacted to people's resistance by devising different counterinsurgency programs. In the case of Chilembwe Uprising, these programs including killing, incarcerating, and deporting all supporters of Chilembwe. Similar programs were evident in the ancient Near East, where the state stepped in when the tensions arose between the village commune and the temple state complex. It needs to be stated here that the 1915 Chilembwe Uprising has been claimed the only significant rebellion in the whole of Africa to be inspired by Christianity prior to the First World War. Because of because it had embraced national interests, today we would call this a national movement. It was the first Central African resistance to European control, which looked to the future and was aimed at founding a nation rather than restoring the fortunes of the tribes. Others have argued that it was a political failure that had no impact on the social life of Malawi. But in a true sense, it signified that the natives were capable of doing anything to transform their situation. The uprising had helpful effects on the social relations as Europeans became more aware of the offense given to Africans. So Chilembwe died as a martyr, but not in vain. After 1915, the shadow of Chilembwe was cast in the private estates, in the missions, and in the legislative council chambers, in the relations between white and black. Although the grievances continued to worsen from 1915 into the 1950s, it remains that Chilembwe's revolution was not a mere symbolic blow. It was a real instrument of change, even if it was 50 years ahead of its time. This is why John Chilembwe will always remain an integral and essential component of the history, not only of Malawi, but of Africa as a whole. Now I try to bring the two contexts into a dialogue between 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 1 and the 1915 Chilembwe Uprising. And this section outlines 3 key areas necessary to facilitate the dialogue. It brings the biblical text and the Malawian context into an interpretive dialogue. We understand that the biblical world and our world are not the same. However, just as there are similarities, there are differences. The first key area to be considered includes mapping out similarities and differences between political and economic oppression defined in 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 1 to 20, and those attached to the 1915 Chilembwe Uprising. We notice that in both cases, forced labor and heavy taxes were married together as economic pursuits of the powerful. The 1915 Chilembwe Uprising stems from the people's knowledge of economies of allocation, which proposes that Malawi, as it was the case with the ancient biblical societies, enjoyed communitarian mode of life before powerful people began introducing exploitive economic mechanisms. We also notice that prophetic voices in both Israel and Malawi arose mainly in opposition to exploitive economic pursuits that are carried by the powerful. The only difference we have is that the revolt in 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 1 to 20, ended in dividing the kingdom into two. We are not sure if this was the people's desire when they brought their grievances to the king. On the other hand, in the 1915 uprising, Chilembwe was clear that his intention was to remove foreign domination and establish an African nation under his leadership. These similarities and differences confirms that economic injustice is the root cause of many problems in the world. From it stems all the violence in the world. The second area involves reflecting on what is contained in the biblical text that contributes to a better understanding of the 1915 Chilembwe Uprising. The social historical context of the ancient Near East which is the larger context of the biblical world, and that of Malawi, have revealed existence of tensions between peasants and the elites. In 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 1 to 20, we saw Jeroboam and the 10 tribes of Israel revolting against the king upon realizing that they were being oppressed. This is what we see in the 1915 Chilembwe Uprising. Upon realizing that his people are being oppressed, Chilembwe led an insurrection. The biblical text, thus, is shedding more light on what Chilembwe did. It helps us to see that Chilembwe was not doing a new thing. It was an old tradition that started in ancient times. The study confirms that any system that works against allocative beliefs creates tensions. Peasants will always resist when they realize that they are being oppressed or exploited. The third area focuses on how the 1915 Chilembwe Uprising sheds light on the context of 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 1 to 20. Through social historical analysis of the 1915 Chilembwe Uprising, we are able to come to grips with the circumstances that led Jeroboam and the 10 tribes to revolt against the King Rehoboam. In a way, Chilembwe enacted the events of 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 1 to 20, so that we have a vivid picture of what took place in its biblical context. What is contained in the Chilembwe Uprising helps us to see why it was important for Jeroboam and the 10 tribes to revolt against Rehoboam. In conclusion, the second and the third key areas necessary to facilitate the dialogue stress that the social historical resonances provide additional interpretive resources for the understanding of the biblical text and the Malawian context. Investigations into the political and economic dimensions of 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 1 to 20, serve as a model for understanding the 1915 Chilembwe Uprising. Getting to grips with economic systems that undergirded biblical societies, communitarian and tributary modes of production, helps us to understand the level of exploitation that forced John Chilembwe to revolt against British rule. Conversely, the actions of Chilembwe and his supporters help us to understand the situation of 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 1 to 20. The 1915 uprising is used in this study as additional interpretive resource that contributes to the understanding political and economic dimensions of 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 1 to 20. The marriage of taxes and forced labor in both contexts opens perspectives for interaction with the text from the biblical and Malawian contexts. That marks the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.